Hey guys, Shelby Smith, Jiminy Crickets coming at you live from the Cricket Castle. You hear a few residual chirps, but they shouldn't be chirping. We don't have any crickets in here in bins. We are in incubation, and I was hoping to film this before we had babies, but when I came and checked on them earlier, we have our first babies hatching. So, best laid plans. That being said, still here to talk to you about incubation today. A couple of things. One thing you might notice in here, this is my only room. So I do not have a dedicated incubation room, hatchery, different conditions, all of those things. It's one thing that has come up in previous videos that people have asked about is, don't you need to incubate at a higher temperature and higher humidity? So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about what works, what hasn't worked in the past, and we will talk about what conditions we have in the barn right now as we're incubating with no additional crickets other than the stray ones that you hear chirping everywhere because free-range crickets happen. So stick around and we'll talk all things incubation. So it is important to note that this is me talking about incubation in a single room setup. Now, if I had my absolute ideal setup, 100% I would have a dedicated incubation chamber, hatchery, whatever you want to call it. If I had the space, I would do that. There are probably ways that I could make something in here that would be similar to an actually grown or an actually built out hatchery, or I don't know what you would call it, incubation chamber. There's ways to do it. I could hang plastic. I could get like a, I've seen people use basically it's kind of a tent, but it's used for like ice fishing. It's like a ice fishing hut. They are generally insulated because ice fishing, you want to have a nice warm enclosure and be shaded from the elements. So something like that could work, but for me, honestly, I have never had any issues hatching out pinheads, so I stick with the methods that work for me, which is a single chamber growing system. So I'll show you what my incubators look like, what conditions we are actually incubating in, and because I have it, I will show you some hatching baby crickets just to prove that I get pinheads even though my setup is not ideal. So, yeah. So here are all my incubators. 1, 2, 4, 7, 8. 8 and 5 is what? 13. Math is hard, kids. So I have about 13 incubators, and not about, I do have 13 incubators. So each of those has hopefully a maximum of like 10 breeding trays in each. Those are 18-gallon storage totes that I bought at Walmart, and I'll show you the contents of them. But this is, we're in the middle, the smack in the middle of my barn. So the reason I put them here in the middle is if I put them at the front, it's closer to the door and it's cooler. Put them at the back, kind of same sort of thing. It's just places where air can get in, because this is not a completely airtight facility. It's pretty tight, but it's not completely airtight. So I moved them to the middle. There is a heater right below me that you can't see. Hello, heater. There is a heater right there. There's a heater at that end, and there's a heater at that end. So by moving them here as opposed to in front of the door where I normally keep them, we're hopefully keeping them a little bit warmer, and because warmer is optimal. It is optimal to incubate at a higher heat and a higher humidity to a point. Like, I want you to know there are limits to the humidity side, and obviously there's limits to the heat side as well. But right now we are sitting at about a cozy 85, 86 degrees in here in this spot. It's enough to turn my cheeks red and make me sweat in leggings and a t-shirt. So it is warm for sure. So I will show you what the contents of the incubators look like. And I do want to bring up a really specific point about a question that I get asked all the time about whether it's going to be a problem or not for the incubation and for the baby crickets, and that is mold. So I will show you a few examples and show you that it's really not that big of a deal in my experience. So there's the incubators. So I also did mention heat and humidity are very important for incubation. So the heat, we keep it at 86 degrees in here. That's no big deal. That predictably gets our crickets to hatch in 10 days. So the day I'm filming this is 11/21. These went in 11/11 and they just started hatching today. So very predictably, 10 days hatching at 86 degrees in the same grow out chamber. Anyways, so the way that we make sure that we keep humidity high is this right here. And that is just the lid. Basically, if you look at this incubator right here, this is all plastic. Everything I put inside of there is damp. Very damp. There's a lot of moisture in what's in here. So if I enclose that in there and then I add heat, which is what the entire environment is heat, it's warm, natural evaporation happens, the humidity levels in the building right now are probably somewhere around 50%. I would wager a bet that we are in the 70s in this incubator. So that's the way we manipulate the humidity, is just the top. So here is a look at the inside of an incubator that is already hatching. So again, these are 10 days in and they've started hatching. As predicted, started hatching today. So something, like I said, you will notice as you look at those, and I'll go back to showing them again. And something that comes up a lot is I have this mold that's growing on my egg trays, essentially. Is this okay? You know, is this gonna hurt the crickets? Did I do something wrong? You did not. I promise you didn't. The reality of it is that eggs are not the only thing that are gonna be dropped on your breeding substrate. Those crickets are gonna poop on there. There's really not a way for you to separate it out. And the other reality is you are basically creating a mold haven just by the environment. So heat and humidity and some bacteria from a variety of different sources is gonna result in mold. There's nothing you can do about it. Luckily, really doesn't cause too many problems for the crickets in terms of hatching. If it gets really thick, which I'll show you an instance of where it's pretty thick and where I probably could have scraped it off a few days ago. I messed with it a little bit today, but it's really not going to cause any issues in terms of the actual hatching of the pinheads. And I will, again, I'll flip this around and I'll show you how many pinheads I have hatching out of one that's decently moldy, and you'll see it's really not a big deal. So mold is a very common problem, and I suppose I should caveat this. This is a specific white mold that I don't necessarily know the identification of, but this white mold has never caused me any problems. There may be kinds that grow that you end up with that might have issues. The way, if you don't have babies hatch, obviously it caused you problems. In which case, what I would recommend, because you can never prevent your crickets from pooping in the breeding substrate, it's just really not possible. What I would recommend doing is switch your breeding substrate source. So if you're using coconut coir and you notice this is an issue, switch to peat moss. If you're using peat moss and noticing this issue, try potting soil. Try it until you get babies to hatch. Once you figure out something that has babies hatching, just stick with that. Don't overcomplicate it. So mold is fine. Too long didn't read. Mold is usually fine. Alright, so just to show you that, see, this mold is not an issue. We got babies. These have, like I said, just started hatching in the last couple hours. And this is very predictable. 10 days. 86 degrees on average, that these guys have started to hatch. out of the incubators. And I did show you guys in a different video how I set my incubators up, but I will include it in this just to make sure that I include as much detail as possible. So I'm trying to decide if I'm going to tear one apart or if I'll just put one back together and show you what it's like. I think I'll just put one together and we'll see what happens. It's probably easier for you to learn that way, and it's easier for me to demonstrate than to take one apart. Although I will take one apart to kind of show you how I stack the trays, though that's not a complete and exact science. So yeah, slight change of plans because all of my incubators are either in use, all wet, or all dirty. So I'm actually going to show you theoretically how you do this in something that I don't typically use as an incubator. It's something that I actually use as a grow out bin, like in my first generation of crickets. So hang tight. Alright, I also had to move the camera down lower so that you can kind of see and I wasn't like this. So these are bins that I would have used initially to grow crickets in, 18-gallon bins, back when I was in a smaller room. So I don't use these anymore, really. I use them sometimes as overflow. I use them more often for sorting if I'm messing around in some live stuff and have different people coming to pick them up. Anyways, it'll work conceptually to show you what we need to do to create an incubator. So you start with a bin, and it's an empty bin, nothing in it. The very first thing I like to do is a little bit of a precaution, and so this precaution is on multiple levels. So one is for moisture. So sometimes when you have when you are adding heat to a very moist environment, you end up with condensation if the air exchange is not correct. So even though there's a ventilation hole in the tops of those bins, sometimes that's not enough air exchange to prevent any condensation. Condensation is lethal to your baby crickets. Absolutely lethal. Will kill them. You will not get viable pinheads. So just know that in your incubation. Make sure that your substrate is not drying out, but also make sure that you are not ending up with massive amounts of condensation. Both will result. One will result, the too dry substrate will result in no pinheads hatching because they dry out and just never make it. The other, your pinheads will hatch, but they will hatch into an environment that is going to kill them quite rapidly. So, delicate balance, but make sure you keep an eye. Don't let it get too dry, but condensation on the walls is a problem. Enter paper towels at the bottom. It helps. Paper towels, egg flats, they're both very hydrophilic, meaning they are very dry and therefore moisture and water wants to go into them. If it's in this, you are not causing problems with condensation overall. If you don't have this, you might end up with condensation problems. So this is kind of a little bit of safety, security blanket, a little bit extra insurance that is very cheap. So you just put this in the bottom layer of the bin, just like that. That's my very first step when I'm setting up my incubator. Second step is always egg flats. These 18-gallon words are hard. 18-gallon incubators, a full egg flat and half egg flat fits in them perfectly. So stick those in there, just like that. So I have one layer of egg flats in the bottom. I have the paper towel underneath. That's what my incubator looks like. And then, I'm actually not going to stack them in there. But one little trick of the trade that, again, I wish I could take credit for. I'm trying to see if I have any. Hold on. One little trick of the trade that will help massively when you are attempting to stack these everywhere. They don't stack super well, at least not in the 18-gallon setup. So one trick is to take an extra one of these, an extra half egg flat, or if you want to cut some like 2/3 ones, those actually work the best because they go up far enough but are not all the way to the top so the pinheads crawl out everywhere. So you take an extra half of these and you stick it in one side like that. And then essentially the little, don't know what to call them, sections, rows of the egg flat functions as like scaffolding. So then you just, whoa, my scaffolding fell over. So then you just kind of lean that there and hope that it stays. So then you just, when you're stacking, if you can like hook the ridge of the pan underneath it, it just ends up being a way more stable structure. So that has been a game changer in terms of stacking, because that is the thing about incubation too, is I know these are two differing cake pans, different sizes and shapes and all of that. You don't want to stack them like this so that the bottom of this one is touching the top of the substrate. You want to offset them so that you have as much surface area of all of them showing as possible. You just, when you end up sticking them end to substrate, what happens is when you go to pick this one up, frickin' half the substrate is stuck to the bottom. And you're going to be taking these in and out once they start hatching. I'll do an entire different video about hatching and dealing with pinheads and all of that probably later on this week, because I have babies hatching. But for now, for incubation, that's just one thing to note. Make sure you're stacking offset before you put them, well, when you put them in the incubator, and try to have it as stable a stack as possible, so when you're pulling it on and off the shelf, they aren't falling off everywhere. Just ends up messy, ends up disastrous. Your eggs still hatch, but it just complicates your life. So yeah, that's how I set up my incubator. And one of the other common questions that I get with the incubation is how often do I check on them once they're in the incubator? This is assuming that I followed all of my procedures post pulling them out of the bin. So once they've had eggs laid in them, after that, I make sure that I spray them down adequately, not too much, not too little. I build the incubator, put things together. I make sure that I mark the date on them so I can keep track of which egg flat or which egg trays came out when, how far am I until hatch date, etc., etc. How often do I check on them? So to be honest, for like the first 5 days, I do very minimal. I will check on them in so much as I'll make sure that they aren't dried out, and I'll make sure there's no condensation. The earlier you get on that and the earlier you notice, the more likely you are to have saved some sort of disaster. So there is such thing as too wet of a substrate. Problem with that is you end up basically rotting the eggs and they won't hatch. Also such a thing as too dry. They dry out, they're not viable as well. There really is, it's like Goldilocks and Three Bears, and it is a just right sort of a situation. So usually an issue with condensation or an issue with drying out will manifest within like the first 5 days. And again, this is assuming that like conditions in your barn aren't drastically changing in those 5 days. Hopefully you have it dialed in to where your conditions are the same. It makes everything more predictable. If you haven't done that yet, I highly encourage you to do that. I do realize that with seasons changing and things like that, that makes things more difficult, but in general, hopefully you have a pretty decent handle on like heat and humidity. If not, it's a good place to start. So once they're about, like I said, first 5 to 7 days, I don't really look at them. Once they hit about day 7, you should start to notice a difference in the eggs. So the first eggs are not super visible. Like they're shiny, they're translucent, they're easy to miss if you don't know what you're looking for. As they start to mature and get closer to hatching, they become very, very visible. They're opaque, they're white. They should be able to be noticed by day 7 for sure. If you are hatching in 10 days, if you can't see eggs at day 7, you might have a problem. So those are things that I look at once we get past the first few days and make sure that conditions are somewhat ideal. Looking for eggs maturing and developing is really, really important. It's an indicator of whether you are going to hatch anything or whether you just wasted all of your time. So these guys that are hatching now, in the next 24 hours will probably get checked on quite frequently. For now, I will not put any of those babies in a bin yet. They just started hatching. There's not enough of them really to gather. They haven't gotten out of where they need to get out of. They need a few more hours to catch the momentum to be worth it. So if not later tonight, because it's only, well, it's 4 o'clock. If not later tonight, then first thing tomorrow is when those babies will get addressed and put into their new homes. And then tomorrow, more than likely, just based off of the egg density that I see in there, I will probably have to tend to them multiple times tomorrow, as in put them in grow out bins. Luckily, we have a whole bunch of them already together as far as egg flats go, so it'll just be put feed, water, and potatoes in. But like I said, I will do an entirely different video about pinheads and reducing pinhead mortality and all of those things. For now, I think that covers most things with the incubation. Like I said, for us, conditions wise, in this single room facility with no separate incubating room, we manipulate the humidity with the tops on the bins. We keep the heat the same for everybody, so it's about 86 degrees. That allows us, like I said, to have a predictable rate of hatch in terms of days to hatch. It's 10 for us. Sometimes it's 11 if it dips below that 86, but it's pretty predictably 10. You can shorten that with a higher heat, run at about 90, 92 degrees, and you can see pinheads in as early as 7 days. It's just not something that I choose to do around here, but you totally can. So 86 degrees, 10 days, and you too can have baby crickets, and mold isn't a problem. Super important to remember that. And that'll be it for me on incubation. If you feel like I missed something, very well could have, please drop me a comment and I will happily get back to you. And if it warrants having another video explaining something or showing something more in depth, really happy to do that. Thanks so much for watching. Really do appreciate your support. If there's anything I can ever do to help, please don't hesitate. While you're at it, like, subscribe, share with your friends. Thanks for being here.